I lied to you last week. Not good, is it? I told you last week that that was going to be the worst sermon you ever heard. But I made a mistake last week also. Is that last Saturday night I did a whole sermon. And then Sunday morning when I came in, I had people who told me if I wasn't done by 9:45, they were going to go watch the Seahawks. So I had to cut the sermon in half. Which is not a great problem until the next week. How many of you here were Saturday night? Now, you're going to get a double dose. But I changed it a little bit. I heard the groan. No, don't do that. Now, I actually thought about having an offering in the middle and letting you go. But I'm going to change it enough, I hope. If you want to get up and leave, it'll cost you $100 on the way out. But I believe this with all of my heart. The idea that what the church is about people becoming attached to each other, close friendships. Now, obviously, some are going to be closer than others and all of that. But what I know, and what I have watched in the last 40-something years being in ministry, is that we never quite get there. And wasn't really sure why, never contemplated to the level of that. And Eugene Peterson's interpretation, or paraphrase of Ephesians 4, talking about how the church should operate, and he writes this, until we're all moving rhythmically and easily with each other, efficient and graceful in response to God's Son, fully mature adults, fully developed within and without, fully alive like Christ. What I have discovered in recent years as I've studied is part of the problem, if not the bulk of the problem, is that we have more generations in our church than the church has ever had before. Now, it's a good kind of a problem to have, except it's a difficult one in the matter of understanding. We've got people in their late 70s trying to understand 16-year-olds. And we wonder why they don't make one body. Now, there's always been the age variance throughout all ages. But there's never been a time in which one generation is so far removed from another generation. And there are so many of them. Now, I'm going to try and make this not so very long, this sermon. I'm going to try and get through it quickly. So if I'm talking too fast, you can raise your hand and say, I'm talking too fast. But if you need to get the notes from it, it'll be on video. He's videotaping it. So these are the 5 generations that are alive today. The GI, the silent, the boomer, the Gen X, and the millennials. Now, we haven't said much about the GI only in passing. And last week I did the whole sermon on Sunday about the silent generation. Saturday night I did the silent generation and the boomer generation. I'm surprised any of you came back. But on Sunday I didn't do the boomer generation, so I'm going to have to do some of it. I'm going to compare today the boomers and Generation X. Now, the idea of this, and why I say it's the worst sermon you'll ever hear, is that it really isn't a sermon. I don't get to say, praise the Lord, and ask for amens and stuff, because it is information-based. And it's the worst form of public communication. But it's information you need to know. Because if this church is going to be a force in this community in the future, we're going to have to work together. And in order to do that, generations are going to have to understand each other. The problem is that many think they do. They're using the same words, and they think they mean the same things. So, I'm going to stretch you today. Now, if you get sleepy, what you do is you put your head on your chest like this, fold your hand. Don't fight it, okay? I want to start off by giving what I think is the best summary of the boomers I've ever heard. And it comes from Abbie Hoffman. You remember Abbie Hoffman? He was a force in the 60s. But he wrote this: "We were here to make a better world. No amount of rationalization or blaming can preempt the moment of choice each of us brings to war situations here on this planet. The lesson of the 60s is that people cared enough to do right to change history. We didn't end racism, but we ended legal segregation. We ended the idea that women are second-class citizens. We made the environment an issue that couldn't be avoided. The big battles that we won cannot be reversed. We were young, self-righteous, reckless, brave, silly, headstrong, and scared half to death, and we were right." That's the boomers. Pretty well describes that generation. Generation X, on the other hand, and I will attempt to do this. Let's see if I can get there. Maybe I can, maybe I can't. Yes, I can. I will give you what I consider to be the synopsis of the Gen X. Comes from the writings of a woman by the name of Sarah Hinckley. And she writes this: "We've never been proud to be Americans." This is a generality. "Our political memory stretches back only as far as Vietnam, Watergate, and Reaganomics. Our parents left religion, and perhaps not coincidentally, each other, in unprecedented numbers. Failed ideologies were mother's milk to us. Love didn't save the world. The age of Aquarius brought us no peace. Sexual liberation brought us AIDS and legions of fatherless children, and Marxism collapsed. We can't even imagine a world of cultural or national unity. Our world is more like a tattered patchwork quilt. We have every little inconsequential thing: computers, home pages, cell phones, but not one important thing to believe in. We are the much-aligned Generation X. Your mission is to get us back to church." Do you hear the difference? And those are only one generation apart. It's not like silence and millennials. So, I'm going to attempt in the next 30 minutes or less, if that can be done, in showing you what I consider to be basic differences. And I'm sorry that it's not a better presentation, but this is the best way I could think. The blue, well, actually it's blue here, it's sort of gray there. That's the boomers, and what did we decide to call it? What do we call that color? Goldenrod, yeah. It's pink here, it's salmon here. So I'm going to start with the economic differences and try and move quickly. Economically, the boomers, because of their size and influence, were America's 800-pound gorilla. For years, we were the ones they were marketing to. The 50s and 60s was on an economic roll. Prosperity was just around the corner. Everybody was excited early on, and there was very little unemployment until we got to the late 80s, and then Ronald Reagan came in, and he promised to put America back to work, and everything was going to be fine. Now we get to the point where we realize that most boomers realize that they're not going to be able to retire. They probably, most of them, a lot of them wouldn't. We're all envious of the ones who retired in their 40s, but lots of people are never going to be able to retire. My retirement plan, according to my accountant, is I have to preach until I'm at least 82, and then I have to preach on Sunday and die before Friday. So I haven't checked with the Social Security people how that works for them. But now, when it comes to the Generation X, they have very little expectation of the economy. They don't expect. See, in the 50s and 60s, we expected all to get rich, didn't we? We expected that we were going to open businesses, we were going to become business executives, we were going to do whatever it was, and we were going to make a lot of money, we were going to change the world. The sky was the limit. for us. Generation X realizes that's not going to happen. And the millennials really know it's not going to happen. Because there's never going to be another generation that made the kind of money and worked the kind of jobs that the silents did. The boomers haven't, and Gen X has lower expectations. Sad part is that the millennials are expecting the government to do it. Really sad. Boomers were born in a time of great excitement, of great energy, all the new things that were happening. Many come back from war and built homes and subdivisions and everything was growing. Gen X grew up in very difficult times and they have a different view of the future. So we've got baby boomers sitting here, we've got Gen X sitting here. We talk about the future and they're totally different words. We talk about prosperity and they're totally different words. We talk about communal activities, very different words, but I'm ahead of myself. One thing about the baby boomers is they were not good savers. Baby boomers liked to spend, which is one of the reasons why so many boats were sold and Corvettes were sold. And Gen X doesn't expect that. I mean, there are exceptions, of course. Education, there's a reason for a lot of this, and a lot of it has to do with education. The boomers were the first generation to grow up under a compulsory federalized education system, which is not a bad thing at all, except that in order to make it work for the people in Rhode Island to be taught the same thing as the kids in Southern California, they had to bring it down a little bit. Now, I'm trying not to editorial too much, but I'm going to tell you this. My father was born in 1905 in a little town in North Dakota. His first language was Norwegian, his second was German, his third was English. By the time he graduated high school, he could read Shakespeare in Latin. They were taught that. He was taught calculus in high school. How many of you ever studied Latin? How many of you can read Latin? How many can, oh yeah, see? How many can spell Latin? It was expected. High school education was the equivalent of what would be, a lot of times, master's education. But when they went to a compulsory, they had to bring the levels way down. And because the boomers, when I was in school, we always had 40 kids in class. I was born in Los Gatos, California. We were the heart of what is now Silicon Valley. It was a growing, prosperous area. The schools were jammed. They couldn't build schools fast enough because, A, the guys coming home from war were feeling amorous, and B, as they hadn't yet developed birth control. So, the classes were very large. We were like the bulge going through the python. The Gen Xers, however, were the educational guinea pigs of the silence and boomer educators. And they tried all the latest fads, which is why about the Gen X group, there was a book, Why Johnny Can't Read, and why the boomers all think that the Gen Xers are a bunch of slackers because their educational system had been brought down even further to where the average 8th grader in the 30s got the same stuff they were getting in senior high school in the Gen X time. Now the test scores, SATs and everything, hit an all-time low with the Gen X. Not because they were stupid, but because the educational system was failing them. They made changes at this point. But a smaller percentage of Generation Xers went to and finished college than any generation before, which says something about the silence, and certainly not as much as the millennial. Now, it doesn't mean they weren't educated. Highly educated. They just didn't feel it necessary to go or finish college. Why should they? Bill Gates didn't. I mean, he went. He didn't finish. Steve Jobs drove by a college or two. Steve Wozniak didn't finish college. Paul Allen didn't finish college, and they all ended up billionaires. So the Gen Xers, early Gen Xers, they knew what they were going to do. They were going to develop a website and sell it for $6 trillion to Google. Really hit college. Now, one of the reasons college educations are so expensive now is because during those years, colleges created great debt because there weren't enough people paying the bills. Interesting how everything ties together. And during Gen X, values clarification and diversity curriculum was more important than reading, writing, arithmetic, or spelling. I had a guy sometime back who was a typical late Gen X. He said, I shouldn't even have taken grammar or English. He says, my computer corrects all my errors now. I don't need to know punctuation. My computer will do it for me. I tried to convince Dr. Walston that when I was working on a paper, and he didn't buy it. So. Politically, during the Cold War and threat of nuclear warfare, boomers learned early that the world is not a safe place. Therefore, they decided to change it. We were going to change the world. Remember? We were going to make it safe for everybody. We saw the boondoggle of Vietnam, and we were going to see that didn't happen again. We were going to change everything. Everybody was going to get free love. Everybody was going to get lots of rock and roll, and drugs were going to be legal. We were going to change the world. And we were going to keep people so busy with sex, drug, and rock and roll, there'd be no more evil in the world. That was our goal. Politically, for the Gen Xers, they don't vote. Statistically, they have the lowest level of voting of any generation that has existed before or since. Their attitude is, whatever. Now, again, these are generalities. But if you're going to have a group, right? And here you have a group of baby boomers that, our motto was vote early, vote often, especially on the same thing, if you get away with it. And we voted on stuff we weren't even supposed to vote on. And then we have the Gen Xers who, you see, they have a different level of optimism or lack thereof. But see, we're trying to produce a family. And we're going to change the world for Christ with different expectations. The boomers think we can do it. The Gen Xers think, try it if you like. Works for you, it's good. It's a major difference. Family, and family is really important here. I was a child in the 50s, I'm a child in the 60s, but see, when I was a little kid, we watched Leave It to Beaver and Ozzie and Harriet. And I don't know whether some of you don't even know what I'm talking about. The millennials don't. But, Mrs. Cleaver, Beaver Cleaver's mother, cleaned the house, scrubbed the toilets, all in a white dress, with her hair coiffed, and she had an apron that was ironed, and it didn't have a single spot. She could make cookies, which of course she did every afternoon, so that the beef would have cookies when he got home from school, which I thought was terribly unfair, because that wasn't what my house looked like. I thought we were the exception. And when my mother did make cookies, especially if she let me help, the kitchen looked like a tornado had hit it. It wasn't at all. And Ozzie and Harriet. I watched Ricky Nelson become a rock star. I worked for a record company at 16. I couldn't figure out how come it worked for him, it didn't work for me. Then I discovered I couldn't sing, which made a huge difference. But see, many of us thought we were the exception. Life was great. Just watch Ozzie and Harriet. I don't ever figure out what Ozzie Nelson did for a living. Now, I know in real life he was a band leader, but on the television show, he didn't work. My dad left in the morning and came home late at night, dirty and smelly. He was a plumbing contractor. And, I don't think Ozzie ever left the house. And somehow they lived in a nicer house than we did. But that was the expectation, that we were going to live like Ozzie and Harriet, or like Ward Cleaver, Ward and June. I just remember June Cleaver's name. I don't remember half of the Bible, but I remember their name. How sad is that? The moral and ethical standards, however, of the boomers really dropped. We didn't care that much about the preceding generation. Even those of us in the church were eager to change the moral and ethical standards, and we did, much to our chagrin. The sexual revolution and the feminist movement contributed to destabilizing the family life and significant increases in the divorce rate. However, family was highly rated by boomers, even if it meant many marriages. They were sort of a serial monogamy. Gen X experienced huge changes in the definition of a family. For the Gen X, especially late Gen X, a family was whatever you made. It could be a mom and a dad and a couple of kids. It could be a mom and dad and no kids. It could be a dad and a dad and 2 kids. It could be a mom and 2 kids. It could be a mom and a dog. A family was I wasn't meaning to be facetious there. A family was whatever they defined it to be. And sometimes, because divorce was so rampant, there were many marriages, and children grew up in many families. But in 1973, the Supreme Court overturned the anti-abortion laws, and the conclusion of the subsequent action of that is the generation is the smallest generation. And interestingly enough, the sociologists say this, that many of the Gen Xers had potential siblings that were aborted, that many of the Gen Xers feel like they were an unwanted generation, that they were only there because their mother didn't get an abortion. And it's created a tremendous effect. And again, it's a generalization on a whole community. And these are a group of people we're trying to talk about celebrate life. They weren't raised to celebrate life. And they were affected by the divorce of their parents. Generation X, 40% of the children came from divorced homes. And many of those have been divorced more than once. These were children who came into the world looking at family life through very fractured lenses. So, what I discovered is that when we talk about family, it doesn't mean the same thing to everyone. It's like Mother's Day. Mother's Day, I never can get it right on Mother's Day. Mother's Day, if we don't celebrate Mother's Day, mothers are hurt. If we celebrate Mother's Day, the women who wanted to be mothers and couldn't be are hurt. There are people who don't come to church on Mother's Day because of that. Now, I told you I wasn't going to extrapolate, but I am. You're going to be here a little longer than you want. But when I first started out, we used to celebrate Mother's Day this way. We'd have the oldest mother in the church stand up, and we'd have the youngest mother in the church stand up. Well, it got to the point where the oldest mother didn't want to admit her age, and the youngest was too young. We didn't want to acknowledge it. So we had to stop all sorts of practices in that. Ironically, the baby boomers were the ones that pushed the sexual liberation in women's lib, but they turned out to be the ones that desired for family. They valued fidelity, and they appreciated monogamy. It was the Gen Xers that everything slid. Here's some interesting statistics. 25% of children of divorce in the Gen X used drugs before the age of 14. 25%. Incredible. Despite their attitudes and actions, Gen X still hold marriage and parenthood in high regard. They are more hungry for community, but also what made them so hungry also makes them less able to create it and sustain it, which is the challenge of the church. Are we going to be able to make it important? I'm going to skip that one. I'm going to go to here. The attitudes that we're dealing with Gen X versus boomers, The boomers were cynics. They were cynical. They remembered Watergate and the oil embargo, and they considered that the government was corrupt and greedy. Can you imagine that? A government that's corrupt and greedy. Now, the Gen Xers have taken cynicism to its almost illogical conclusion, and it shows by the fact that they really don't vote as a group. But the Gen X distrust towards people in authority was reinforced by things like the Iran-Contra situation, which whatever side you're on was an awkward side. And remember Gary Hart? Gary Hart ran for president. While he was running for president, he was fooling around with a woman by the name of Donna Rice on a boat called Monkey Business. And the Gen Xers said, yeah, that's it. This is the best we can do. And the boomers sort of started to celebrate the sexual freedom, I guess. But Christianity also took a hit with credibility because we had our own. We had Jim Bakker, Jim and Tammy Faye, and we had Jimmy Swaggart. Both major Christian figures on the world stage, both of them deeply flawed. Both of them fell into sin on a national scale. One went to prison, the other said it was none of our business what it was. So the Gen X said, see, the church is just as bad as the government. Can't trust the government, can't trust the church. At least the boomers had hope that the church could be made into something. Gen X, their natural inclination is they don't trust any, and boomers thought we didn't trust anybody. Gen X has very little expectation of the church, that the church is going to do anything of any real value, so they stay away in large numbers. Now, as I told you last week, interestingly enough, we have the largest portion of our congregation are Gen X, which says something. We're not exactly sure what it says yet, but it says something. And I want to say this, and then I'll skip the rest of this, part of this. For the Gen X, everything is about options, which is why Gen Xers attend church less frequently than any generation before, even Christian Gen X, because it's all about the options. And you've heard me say it a dozen times. I'll call somebody on the phone and say, hey, would you usher, or would you do this on the 27th of January? And their response is, yes, if I'm there. But I don't know where I'm going to be. I don't know what my options will be. See, silence had very few options. The boomers extended the options. Gen X took options. I mean, you go to an ATM machine. I hate it when it says, press for English. Gen X are going to see, and the millennials are going to see, it's going to say English, Spanish, Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese. You see? But they're not going to have a problem with it. Options. Options. I would take the rest of the day, but I'm not going to. I'm going to move. Other options are other influences that have affected. The big one for the boomers was television. Most boomers don't remember when we didn't have television. I'm old enough, I was one of the first boomers. I remember we didn't have a TV. We had to go down the street to the neighbors to watch the Cisco Kid. Gen Xers, not only did they not remember a time where there wasn't a television, I've got kids on my block that are 9 years old that have cell phones. Now, I suppose if I had a 9-year-old daughter who was walking to school, I'd put a cell phone on her too, and a 45. But yeah, that is another sermon. And it's even said that since the Generation X didn't grow up during the turbulent times of the civil rights protest, they learned about civil rights through the television series Roots. Boy, there's a history lesson for you. So I want to finish with this. Well, finish is a relative word. Yeah. Spirituality. With the boomers brought spiritual awakening back to America, but the spirituality was not the Judeo-Christian variety. It was just spiritual. Absolute truth, as in Orthodox Christianity, was replaced by belief that there are many roads to God. which was furthered by the high priestess of the modern spirituality, Oprah Winfrey. Even though I saw the future on Oprah Winfrey the other night, yes, I watched Oprah Winfrey because Rick Warren was on. And of course, I watched Rick Warren anywhere he was. And interestingly enough, and the whole show was good because there was an Australian evangelist who was born with no arms and no legs who preached Christ. And Oprah was fine with that because, it's just one of the ways. But what I saw in the future was that Rick Warren sat at one end of the table, she sat at the other, and on the back wall were all these giant screens. And, one was Twitter, excuse me, one was Facebook, one was LinkedIn or whatever. And so people throughout the country were sending in questions. And even people sitting, I sort of say congregation, in the audience, on their tablets, were asking questions and making comments. Now, they were being filtered, obviously, or you can imagine what would happen on less than a 3-minute delay. But I saw the future. In the future, what's going to happen is that you all are going to sit out there with your laptops and you're going to make comments. Because Gen X likes interaction. Gen X doesn't want to sit and watch. They want to participate. Now, is that bad? Not at all. It may make it a little awkward to get used to, and it may break the continuity that is so important to the boomers and before. But it was interesting that I saw the future on Oprah Winfrey. Not only was it odd, it was scary. But, let's see, where was it? Even amongst Christians, in the baby boomers, the mix and match variety of spirituality has come to the forefront. Now, the Generation Xers don't attend church as a group and do not have a positive image of organized religion. They don't have a good view of anything organized, which works for us since we're so disorganized. Thank you very much. Thank you. But here's one of the major differences, and this is what I really like about this, is that Gen X, who are Christian, believe that an authentic faith needs to be personally healing and transformational. At the same time, world-changing. Faith in Jesus Christ should have an impact on the problems and pain of people worldwide. How do you like that? What audacity to think that we should solve problems worldwide. Here's my pitch, and it was Bono, of all people, who first showed it to us. The American church has enough money to end poverty worldwide. The boomers are tax conscious. Don't tax us. The boomers are much more material than the Gen Xers. The boomers could have, we had enough money, we could have solved poverty. We also, the boomers in the church, had enough money to provide the AIDS serum to the African continent, which is more Christian than we are, by the way, numerically. We could have ended AIDS there had we cared enough. We simply didn't. What Generation X is saying to us is, if those things don't care to you, we won't join. We won't play. Because to them, if it's going to be real, it's got to be transformational. It can't just be come and watch. It can't just be come and sing a song, listen to a sermon and go home. What Gen X is requiring of us for the future is, if we're going to do it, let's do it. If not, let's go do something else. Actually, I like that. I think the boomers were far too complacent. We were more concerned whether we had comfortable facilities and nice lighting, and those are all important things. We built crystal cathedrals, we built monuments to ourselves, and people, especially children in faraway places, who were the children of Christian parents, starved to death. And it didn't really affect us very much. Gen X is not going to allow the church to do that. The millennials on the other end, we don't know yet. I'll be talking about them next week. But according to the sociologists, if the church doesn't get her act together, generation won't play. We've got some work to do. And we need for all the voices to be heard, for all the voices to be respected, and for it to make a difference. Will that preach? I guess I could say praise the Lord to that. Okay? Heavenly Father, that the many would be one. That while we have different gifts, different talents, we come from different generations, we need to learn the same meaning for the words that we use. And we need to be challenged by each other. The older challenging the younger, and the younger challenging the older. I pray, Father, that this church would become truly intergenerational, not multi-generational. That every generation will feel a place here and feel that they have a voice in what happens and how the church functions and how we accomplish the mandate of making disciples of all people. It's a major task. We can't do it. You can. So we're reaching out, Father, asking that you will accomplish something in us that will be extraordinary and exceptional because you're working through us. I pray that we make ourselves available to you. In Jesus' name.